12-year-old girl dares to take on a corrupt cop, but the deeper she digs into her father's disappearance, the more dangerous the truth becomes. How far will she go before those in power try to silence her? This story is one that stays with you. Where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments. We love hearing from you. And if you believe in fighting for justice, make sure to hit like and share this story with someone who needs to hear it. Now let's step into Amira's world, where courage meets corruption, and every truth uncovered comes at a price. The night was still. Too still. Amira Johnson sat curled up in her father's old armchair, the worn leather cool beneath her fingertips. She flipped through the pages of his journal, her last connection to him. The ink had faded, but his words remained, pressing against her like whispers from the past. Then, a sharp knock. She froze. The clock on the wall ticked. Once, twice. Silence. Slowly she rose and crept toward the door. When she opened it, the porch was empty. No footsteps, no voices, just the cold night air wrapping around her skin. Her eyes dropped to the ground, a single envelope. A shiver ran down her spine as she picked it up, fingers trembling slightly as she tore it open. The paper inside was rough, the words scrawled in jagged, hurried strokes. If you keep digging into the past, you'll disappear, just like your father. Her pulse pounded in her ears. The ink was fresh. Someone had left this moments ago. Then, the low rumble of an engine. She looked up. A black sedan rolled past, crawling at an unnerving pace. Not stopping, not speeding, just watching. For a split second, the driver's face flickered in the dim glow of the street lamp. Just enough for her to know that whoever they were, they wanted her to see them. Then the car slipped back into the shadows. Amira's hands clenched around the letter. Fear coiled in her chest, but beneath it, something stronger took root. They thought they could scare her. They thought she'd run. They were wrong. The house had always felt smaller without him. Amira wandered into her father's study, the scent of old books and worn paper wrapping around her like a ghost of the past. Her fingers brushed over the deep groove on his desk, a mark from the night he slammed his fist down in frustration over a case. She remembered watching from the doorway, too young to understand the weight he carried. She could still hear his voice. Justice isn't easy, Amira. She turned, and there he was, kneeling before her like he always did when he had something important to say. If you believe in the truth, you have to protect it, even when it scares you. She had been so young, staring into his eyes, wide and full of admiration. Back then, she had believed her father was untouchable. Now, he was gone, and no one dared to say his name. Her throat tightened. She looked down at the letter still clutched in her hand. If the truth had cost her father his life, then she would make sure it wasn't buried with him. The courthouse was suffocating. Rows of wooden benches filled the room, the air thick with whispers and tension. At the front, a man sat, his wrists shackled in handcuffs, his posture resigned, like he already knew how this would end. Amira sat in the back, unnoticed, until she saw him. Detective Robert Langley. He stood tall, his uniform crisp, his badge gleaming under the sterile courtroom lights. He spoke with the confidence of a man who had done this before, who had twisted the truth so many times that it had become second nature. And the jury? They nodded along, swallowing every word like it was gospel. A slow burn of anger coiled in Amira's chest. She had read the reports. She knew the truth. This wasn't justice, it was theater. She couldn't stay quiet. She stood. That's not true, she said, her voice cutting through the murmurs like a blade. Heads turned. Langley's eyes found her. Cold. Calculating. Then, he smirked. A kid speaking out in court, he mused, shaking his head. That's cute. Chuckles rippled through the crowd, amusement and disbelief mingling in the air. Amira's heart pounded, but she lifted her chin. You're lying, she said, louder this time. You twisted the facts, you. Langley held up a hand, silencing her with nothing but a gesture. A little girl like you thinks she understands the law? His voice was low, mocking. You got guts, kid, but this isn't a playground. This is the real world, and in the real world, people like you should know when to stay quiet. A challenge. A warning. Amira felt the weight of every eye in the room pressing down on her, waiting for her to shrink back. Slowly, deliberately, she sat down. Not because she was afraid, but because she knew this was just the beginning. Langley might have dismissed her now, but soon, very soon, he would regret it. The rain had settled into a soft, steady rhythm against the window, filling the silence that had swallowed the house whole. The air inside was thick, thick with dust, thick with memories. Amira hesitated at the doorway of her father's study, gripping the edge of the frame as if crossing that threshold would change something. Maybe it already had. She hadn't stepped inside for months, not since the day they told her he was gone. Taking a slow breath, she stepped forward. The room felt smaller now, the bookshelves looming over her, the scent of old paper wrapping around her like a whisper from the past. Her father had spent countless nights here, bent over his desk, sleeves rolled up, lost in his work. Work that had gotten him killed. She ran her fingers over the wooden surface, pausing at a deep groove near the edge. A memory flickered, her father's fist slamming down in frustration, his voice sharp but tired. They think they can bury the truth, but the truth always finds a way. Her throat tightened. She pulled out the desk drawer, half expecting it to be empty, ransacked like everything else in the case. But buried beneath old legal pads and worn-out pens, her fingers brushed against something familiar. A leather-bound journal. Her breath caught. She had seen this before, held it before. But back then, she hadn't known what to look for. Now she did. Settling onto the floor, she flipped it open, eyes scanning his precise handwriting. At first, it was what she expected: case notes, trial dates, legal arguments meticulously laid out. But then, the shift. The handwriting turned frantic. Sentences cut short, words underlined, sometimes twice, sometimes 3 times. Entire pages dedicated to names, dates, connections, pieces of a puzzle he had been racing to solve. Some names were crossed out, others circled. Some had question marks beside them. And then, at the very end, Michael Barrett. The name was circled so thickly that the pen had almost torn through the page. Her pulse quickened. Michael Barrett. She didn't know much about him, only that he was a former detective, one of the few people her father had ever trusted, or at least had tried to. She glanced back at the other names. Some she recognized: judges, attorneys, officers. Others she had never seen before. But this wasn't just a list. This was a trail. A trail her father had been following before he disappeared. Her grip tightened around the journal. For years, she had waited for someone to tell her the truth. Now, she would find it herself. She traced her fingers over the ink, the weight of her father's work pressing down on her like a silent plea. Michael Barrett. It was time to find him, and something told her. He had been waiting for her, too. The phone rang. Amira flinched, nearly dropping the leather journal still clutched in her hands. It was late, too late for anyone to be calling. For a moment she hesitated, staring at the screen as an unknown number flashed across it. She should ignore it, she should let it go to voicemail. But something inside her, something deeply instinctual, told her she couldn't. She answered. Hello? Silence. Then, a voice, low, rough, urgent. You don't know who you're up against, kid. Amira's breath hitched. She tightened her grip on the phone. Who is this? Michael Barrett. Her pulse kicked up a notch. The name from her father's journal. The one circled so heavily the ink nearly tore through the page. Your father? He was onto something. Something big. I can't talk over the phone. Meet me at Eastway Diner. 1 hour. No latic. The line went dead. The neon open sign flickered against the rain-soaked glass as Amira approached the diner. It was quiet, too quiet. Inside, the smell of burnt coffee and fried food lingered, but there was something else, something heavy, something wrong. Her sneakers squeaked softly against the tile as she stepped in, eyes scanning the room. A waitress behind the counter barely looked up. A trucker sat hunched over his meal, lost in thought, and then her stomach twisted. A man sat slumped in the farthest booth, his back to the wall. His coffee sat untouched. The cigarette in the ashtray had burned down to nothing but a cold pile of ash. And the blood, a dark stain spreading across his shirt. Michael Barrett was dead. Amira's body locked up. For a moment she couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Then, panic crashed into her. She rushed forward, hands gripping the edge of the table. Mr. Barrett? Her voice was barely a whisper. No response. His skin had gone pale, lips slightly parted, as if he had been about to speak. As if his last words had been stolen from him. Her chest tightened. Someone had done this. Someone had gotten to him before he could tell her the truth. Her heart pounded as she glanced around the diner. The trucker hadn't moved. The waitress was still wiping down the counter, unaware or pretending to be. Was the killer still here, watching her? The walls suddenly felt like they were closing in. She needed to leave, now. But then, she saw it. A slip of paper. Small. Barely noticeable. Tucked just beside Barrett's lifeless hand. Her fingers trembled as she reached for it, flipping it over. 2 words. Scrawled in rushed, uneven handwriting. Carter knows. A chill shot down her spine. Judge William Carter. The man who had sat behind the bench for years, delivering verdicts with a cold, unreadable expression. The man her father had once called untouchable. If Barrett had been right, if Carter was involved, then this wasn't just about one corrupt detective anymore. This was bigger. Much bigger. And now, someone wanted her to know that they were watching. Someone wanted her to be afraid. But fear wasn't an option. Not anymore. The moment Amira stepped out of the diner, the cold air hit her like a slap. Her mind was still reeling. Carter knows. The words on that crumpled slip of paper burned into her brain like a brand. She needed to think. She needed to get home. The blare of a siren cut through the night. Red and blue lights flashed against the rain-slick pavement, reflecting off the diner's windows like a warning. A squad car, and stepping out of it, Detective Robert Langley. Her stomach twisted. She turned to run, but it was too late. Going somewhere? His voice was smooth, casual, like they were old friends catching up. She didn't answer. Langley sighed, shaking his head. You just don't know when to quit, do you? Amira took a step back. Barrett is dead, she said, forcing the words through her tightening throat. And I'm guessing that's not a coincidence. Langley smiled. Not with warmth, but with something far colder. Funny thing about that, he mused. We got a call. Someone matching your description seen at the scene. Disturbing evidence. Her heart pounded. That's a lie. Langley shrugged. Doesn't really matter, does it? He gestured to the officer beside him. Take her in. Amira barely had time to protest before rough hands grabbed her arms, yanking them behind her back. The snap of handcuffs bit into her wrists. She thrashed, but it was useless. Wait, I didn't. Save it. Langley cut her off, opening the car door. You wanted to get involved in grown-up matters? Well, welcome to the real world, kid. Then, the door slammed shut, and the world outside blurred as the car pulled away. The holding cell smelled like sweat and old coffee. The walls were dull gray, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. Amira sat on the cold metal bench, staring at the scuffed floor. She wasn't scared. At least, that's what she told herself. But her hands were still shaking. She had always known she was playing a dangerous game. But this was different. She could still hear Langley's voice, taunting her. Could still see the smirk on his face when they shoved her into the squad car. How far would he go? Would they really lock up a kid just to silence her? The sound of footsteps echoed down the hall. Then, a voice. You're free to go. The cell door creaked open, but Amira didn't move. She should have been relieved. Instead, dread pooled in her stomach like lead. They wouldn't just let her go. Not like this. Langley had arrested her to send a message. So why was she suddenly free? She stepped out slowly, her eyes scanning the dimly lit hallway. An officer stood waiting, older, his uniform pressed but tired. He didn't meet her gaze as he led her toward the exit. But as they reached the door, he hesitated. Then, without looking at her, he leaned in. His voice was barely more than a whisper. Leave town, kid. A pause. Before it's too late. A chill ran down Amira's spine. She turned to look at him, but his face was unreadable. Then, before she could say a word, he stepped back. The door buzzed open. She was free. But nothing about this felt like freedom. The night air was thick with the scent of rain and asphalt as Amira stepped outside the precinct. The city stretched before her, quiet but watchful, like it was waiting to see what she would do next. She should be scared. She should listen to that cop's warning. But she wouldn't. Couldn't. Barrett was dead. Murdered. Her father had disappeared, and now she knew why. He had gotten too close to something. And now, so had she. She looked down at her wrists, faint red marks where the cuffs had been. A reminder. Langley wanted her to feel powerless. The system wanted her to stay silent. But if she walked away now, then Barrett had died for nothing. Her father had disappeared for nothing. And she couldn't let that happen. She took a slow breath, tightening her fists. They thought she was just a kid. They thought she would back down. They were wrong. Turning on her heel, she disappeared into the city, her mind already racing. She had work to do. The courtroom wasn't just a room, it was a battlefield. The air was thick with the weight of expectation, skepticism, and something colder, doubt. Amira stood behind the defendant's table, her small frame swallowed by the towering figures around her. Suits and uniforms filled the rows behind her, their gazes sharp, measuring. Some looked amused, others indifferent. They didn't think she belonged here. They were wrong. She clenched her fists, forcing herself to steady her breath. The cuffs had left faint red marks on her wrists, a reminder. A gavel struck wood, sharp and final. Order in the court. Judge William Carter adjusted his glasses, his expression unreadable. He exuded the kind of authority that came with years of delivering verdicts, each one carrying the weight of the law. But now, his gaze lingered on Amira a beat too long. He was studying her. Not as a lawyer, not as a threat, as a child. Finally he sighed, fingers drumming against the bench. His voice, when he spoke, was measured, composed. "Miss Johnson, you do understand the gravity of this case, don't you?" Amira lifted her chin. "Yes, Your Honor." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Someone scoffed under their breath. A woman at the prosecution's table, Langley's lawyer, shook her head, exchanging a knowing glance with her client. Langley smirked. She ignored them. Judge Carter exhaled through his nose, flipping through the case file in front of him. Then his gaze settled on her again, this time softer, more deliberate. "Are you sure you want to continue this?" A question, a warning, a way out. She could feel it, the weight of the moment. If she hesitated, if she so much as flinched, this would be over before it even began. She knew what he was doing, trying to make her second-guess herself. Trying to make her realize that standing against men like Langley, against an entire system that was built to silence people like her, was impossible. But he didn't know her, didn't know what she had lost, didn't know that fear wasn't an option anymore. She swallowed hard, took a breath, and then, "Yes, Your Honor." Her voice didn't shake, and this time, neither did her hands. The courtroom was suffocating, not because of the temperature, but because of the weight in the air, the expectation, the scrutiny, the silent judgment pressing down on her like an unseen force. Amira stood tall behind the defense table, her fingers tightening around the worn file in her hands. Across the room, Langley sat with his usual smugness, his confidence radiating like a man who had spent his life untouchable. He wasn't worried. Not yet. She inhaled slowly, steadying herself before turning to the bench. "Your Honor, I would like to submit evidence into the record." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. The prosecutor straightened in her seat, already preparing to object. Judge Carter adjusted his glasses, peering down at her with the same unreadable expression he always wore. "What evidence, Miss Johnson?" Amira pulled the document from her satchel and stepped forward. The paper was creased, its edges slightly worn. It had almost been lost, erased, buried. But now, it was in her hands. She held it up for the court to see. "Detective Robert Langley's disciplinary record," she said, her voice clear. The reaction was instant, a collective gasp, a shift in the energy of the room. Langley's smirk faltered. The prosecutor shot to her feet. "Objection! That document is sealed and inadmissible." Judge Carter held up a hand, silencing the noise. His eyes sharpened as they settled on Amira. "Where did you get this?" She didn't hesitate. "The truth has a way of resurfacing, Your Honor. This file contains multiple misconduct reports, allegations of excessive force, intimidation, and evidence tampering, all conveniently wiped from public record." She turned, facing the jury now, her voice unwavering. "Detective Langley has a history of abusing his power, and every time, someone made sure it disappeared." The whispers grew louder. A few jurors exchanged uncertain glances. The weight of the revelation had begun to settle in. Then, a sharp, deliberate sound. The clench of Langley's jaw, the slow curl of his fingers into fists. His mask was slipping. "You don't know what you're talking about, kid." His voice was low, edged with something dangerous. Amira held his gaze. "But now, everyone does." Langley leaned forward slightly, his expression darkening. His attorney whispered something to him, urgent, but he barely seemed to hear her. He wasn't smirking anymore. Judge Carter exhaled slowly, his fingers drumming against the bench as he studied the document in front of him. His face remained neutral, but there was something different in his eyes now, something calculating. "Is this document authentic?" Amira met his gaze, her pulse steady. "Yes, Your Honor, and I can prove it." The judge didn't respond right away. He looked at Langley, then at the jury, then back at Amira. Finally, he leaned back in his chair, nodding once. "Then by all means, Miss Johnson," he said, "proceed." And just like that, the tide began to turn. The air in the courtroom was thick, not just with shock, but with something deeper. Realization. Doubt. Fear. Amira could feel it pressing in from all sides, the weight of the truth teetering on the edge, waiting to crash down. She reached into her satchel once more. This time, she didn't pull out a document. This time, she pulled out a recording device. Taking a steady breath, she placed it on the table in front of her. "Your Honor," she said, keeping her voice even, controlled, "I have one final piece of evidence to submit." A ripple of murmurs swept through the courtroom. The prosecutor immediately stood, her voice sharp. "Objection! This is turning into a spectacle. Sit down." Judge Carter's voice cut through the noise, calm but firm. For the first time, Amira saw a flicker of something in his eyes, something tense. "What evidence, Miss Johnson?" She met his gaze. Then, without breaking eye contact, she pressed play. At first, there was nothing but static. Then, a voice. Cold, measured, undeniable. "That girl knows too much. Handle it." The room held its breath. Then, chaos. Gasps. A sudden burst of whispers. A juror stiffened in his seat, eyes widening. The prosecutor fumbled with her pen, knocking over her papers. Even the bailiff, usually an unmoving presence, shifted slightly. All eyes turned to Judge William Carter. He didn't move, didn't blink. But for the first time, Amira saw it. A crack in the facade. Langley shot up from his chair, his face darkening. "What the hell is this?" "A recording of a conversation between Detective Langley and Judge Carter," Amira answered. Her voice didn't waver. "The judge you all trust, the man sitting right in front of us, wasn't just ignoring the corruption." She let the words settle before delivering the final blow. He was running it. The courtroom erupted. The prosecutor turned pale. Jurors exchanged wide-eyed glances. The press at the back scrambled for their phones, typing furiously. Carter finally spoke, his voice low, controlled. "This is a mistake." Amira tilted her head slightly. "Is it?" A muscle in his jaw twitched. Langley, still standing, turned toward Carter now, his expression shifting from anger to something more dangerous. Betrayal. "You set me up." His voice was sharp, shaking. Carter didn't look at him. "Watch yourself, detective," he warned, his voice dangerously even. But it was too late. The courtroom had seen the truth. The untouchable judge was no longer untouchable. The carefully constructed empire of power, intimidation, and corruption was beginning to crumble. And for the first time, Amira saw fear in his eyes. The city at night was never truly silent. There was always something. Distant traffic humming through the streets, a siren wailing far off, the occasional flicker of a street lamp fighting to stay lit. But tonight, the air carried something else. A presence. Amira felt it before she saw it. She had left the courthouse nearly an hour ago, her mind still racing from what had just unfolded. Carter was no longer untouchable. The truth was cracking through the surface, and now, they knew she wasn't stopping. But someone wasn't happy about that. A low rumble. Her stomach clenched. She glanced over her shoulder. A black sedan, moving too slowly. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She quickened her pace, tucking her hands into her jacket to steady them. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was just... The car sped up. A sharp gust of wind rushed past, sending loose paper skidding across the sidewalk. She turned the next corner, feet moving faster. The car followed. No, this wasn't paranoia. This was real. She broke into a run. The world blurred past her. Dark alleyways, flickering signs, the distant neon glow of a gas station. Then, the roar of an engine. Tires screeched, headlights flared straight at her. Adrenaline took over. She leapt to the side, crashing onto the pavement just as the car sped past, barely missing her. Pain exploded up her hands and knees. She gasped, the impact rattling through her bones. But she couldn't stop. She scrambled to her feet, ignoring the sting in her legs, the sharp throbbing in her palms. The car didn't slow down, didn't turn back. It had done its job. A warning. She sucked in a shaky breath, looking around. No witnesses, no cameras. Just the empty streets and the distant pulse of the city. The weight of what just happened settled in. They had tried to kill her. She didn't know how long she ran. By the time she stopped, her legs ached and her hands were raw from the fall. The cold air bit into her skin, but she barely felt it. She ducked into a dimly lit alley, pressing herself against the rough brick wall. Her pulse was still erratic, her breath uneven. Then, her phone rang. She flinched. A number she didn't recognize. Her fingers hovered over the screen. Let it go to voicemail. Just let it ring. But she knew better. This wasn't a wrong number. This wasn't a coincidence. She exhaled shakily and pressed answer. Silence. Then, a voice. Calm. Deadly. You're digging too deep, kid? Her grip tightened around the phone. A pause. Keep going and you'll regret it. Click. The line went dead. For a long moment, Amira didn't move. The words settled into her bones, curling around her like a noose. This wasn't a threat. It was a promise. She swallowed hard, forcing the fear down. They wanted her to stop, wanted her to be afraid. But if they were willing to kill to bury the truth, then she was closer than ever. She straightened, wiping her scraped palms against her jeans, her breath evening out. They thought this would scare her. They thought she would back down. They were wrong. Amira turned and stepped back into the city lights. She wasn't running anymore. The air inside the courtroom felt different now. It was no longer charged with tension, it was thick with realization. The kind of realization that shattered illusions. Amira stood firm, her hands steady against the worn wooden table. The truth was no longer creeping through the cracks. It was here. Undeniable. Inescapable. She reached into her satchel, pulled out the small, unassuming recording device, and placed it on the table. The murmurs started immediately. Amira didn't look at the jury, or the prosecution, or even Langley. She looked at Coroner, she said, her voice even, measured. I have one final piece of evidence. The prosecutor shot up from her seat. Objection. This is overruled. Carter's voice cut in, sharp, but too quick, like he already knew what was coming, like he had already lost. Amira pressed play, static. Then a voice, cold, deliberate. That girl knows too much. Handle it. Carter's voice filled the courtroom. Gasps. Someone in the gallery dropped a pen. A juror visibly stiffened, his grip tightening around the armrest. But Amira wasn't done. She pressed another button. A second recording crackled to life. Langley's voice. What do you want me to do? She's just a kid. A pause. Then, Carter's response. Then, make her disappear. The courtroom erupted. A journalist in the back fumbled with his notepad. A woman in the gallery let out an audible gasp, covering her mouth. Jurors exchanged frantic looks, trying to process what they had just heard. The judge's bench was no longer a seat of power. It was a stage, a place where the man behind the gavel was no longer the one delivering the verdict. He was the one being judged. But Carter didn't speak. He didn't move, didn't flinch. But Amira could see it now. The slight tension in his jaw, the controlled stillness of his hands, like he was bracing for impact. And then, Langley snapped. The detective shot up from his chair, knocking it over with a loud scrape against the floor. His face was flushed red, his breaths fast and uneven. This is bullshit, he barked. His voice wasn't controlled anymore. It was raw, angry, desperate. I was just following orders. Silence. Not the kind that brought relief. The kind that suffocated. All eyes turned to Carter, but still he said nothing. Langley let out a bitter laugh. His hands were shaking now, but not from fear, from fury. He turned to the courtroom, his voice rising. You think I was in charge? His laugh was sharp, humorless. You really think this all stops with me? Amira didn't move. The jury didn't move. The prosecutor was completely still. Langley's breath came out ragged, his fists curled, and then he pointed, straight at Carter. You think I was running the show? He scoffed, shaking his head. Then, he was. Dead silence. No more gasps, no more whispers. Just the weight of what had been said, pressing down on every person in the room. Every single one. Judge William Carter slowly removed his glasses, setting them on the bench in front of him. He still didn't speak, didn't look at Langley, didn't look at Amira. But for the first time, he looked small. The powerful man who had once controlled the fate of others was now just another man exposed for what he truly was. His time was up, and he knew it. The courtroom felt different now. The tension had shifted. No longer was Amira the one under scrutiny. No longer was she the one people doubted. Now, all eyes were on them. Langley sat rigid in his chair, his once smug demeanor completely gone. His hands were cuffed in front of him, a deputy standing close by, ready to escort him out. The judge presiding over the case, not Carter, not anymore, flipped through the verdict form, his voice steady as he spoke. Detective Robert Langley, you have been found guilty on multiple counts, including obstruction of justice, conspiracy, and misconduct in office. Sentencing will be carried out in due time. The words hit like a gavel striking wood. A murmur rippled through the crowd, some nodding in grim satisfaction, others whispering to themselves. The press in the back scribbled furiously, cameras clicking, capturing the moment when one of the city's most untouchable officers had finally fallen. Amira exhaled, the weight in her chest loosening just slightly. It was over, or at least, it should have been. Because one man was still standing, Judge William Carter. Unlike Langley, he wasn't handcuffed, wasn't panicking, wasn't even defending himself. He simply sat there, his hands folded neatly on the table in front of him, watching, waiting. And then, as the room began to empty as people rushed to leave and spread the news, he turned and looked directly at Amira. A long, careful look. Then in a voice just loud enough for her to hear, he said, "Justice isn't as simple as you think it is, Amira." Her stomach twisted. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't an admission of guilt. It was something worse, a warning. And as Carter stood, calm, untouchable, still in control of something she hadn't uncovered yet, Amira realized one thing. This wasn't over. The cold air outside the courthouse felt sharper than before. Amira pulled her jacket tighter around her, stepping onto the sidewalk as reporters swarmed past, chasing headlines, chasing the next big scandal. The world was already moving on, but she wasn't. She should have felt relief. She should have felt like she had won. So why did it feel unfinished? Her mind replayed Carter's words over and over again. Justice isn't as simple as you think it is, Amira. What did he mean? What wasn't she seeing? Her thoughts were cut short when she reached her apartment door. Something was off. A small, unmarked envelope sat on the ground. She bent down, fingers hesitating before picking it up. There was no return address, no postage stamp. Someone had delivered it by hand. A chill ran through her as she carefully tore it open. Inside was a single slip of paper. The handwriting was rushed, uneven, like whoever wrote it didn't have much time. Only 8 words. Daniel Vaughn is still alive, but not how you think. Her breath caught. Daniel Vaughn, her father. 1,000 thoughts crashed into her at once. This had to be a lie, a trick. He was gone. He had been gone for years. But then, why did Carter walk away so calmly? Why did it feel like he knew something she didn't? Her grip tightened around the note, her pulse pounding in her ears. This wasn't over. Not even close. Because if Daniel Vaughn was still alive, then she had only scratched the surface of the truth, and the real fight was just beginning. If this story kept you on the edge of your seat, don't forget to like this video and share it with others who love powerful, thought-provoking stories. Your support means the world to us. And if you want to see more stories like this, full of mystery, justice, and deeper truths, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss an update. Your engagement helps us keep creating meaningful content that sparks conversation and makes a difference. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next story. Top of form, bottom of form,